What if the Church's fear of witches stemmed not from their supposed magic, but from the authority it was losing? Picture a world where a mere accusation could end your life, no proof, no defense, just whispers of doubt. Now imagine this isn't the medieval era of Europe, but a fragile settlement in the New World, built by men who preached religious liberty yet enforced faith with flames and nooses. The Salem Witch Trials are often dismissed as a bizarre outburst of Puritan paranoia. But what if they were more than that? What if the witches of Salem were feared not for brewing potions or casting spells, but for challenging a brittle system rooted in control, uniformity, and male dominance? Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient tales, hidden terrors, and supernatural conflicts come alive. If you're fascinated by the unspoken truths of mythology, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on every epic story. The spark of fear didn't ignite in Salem. It was kindled centuries earlier in Europe, where paranoia consumed the continent. Mostly women were torn from their homes, tortured, and killed, not for proven crimes, but for suspicion alone. The witch hunts of early modern Europe weren't chaotic outbursts. They were deliberate, organized, and fueled by dread, not just of the supernatural, but of anything inexplicable, feminine, or different. In places like Germany, Switzerland, and France, the fires of persecution blazed fiercely. But contrary to popular belief, the peak of witch hunts wasn't during the so-called Dark Ages. It was in the supposedly enlightened era of 1560 to 1660, as historian Brian Levack notes in The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe, 2006. During this period, social unrest and religious turmoil created a breeding ground for fear. Plagues, crop failures, and invasions left communities desperate for answers. When reason faltered, they blamed demons. Superstition thrived where science paused. The Church, once skeptical of witchcraft's reality, shifted its stance, declaring witches not just misguided but agents of Satan himself. Enter figures like Agnes Waterhouse, the first woman executed for witchcraft in England in 1566. Her crime? Owning a cat named Satan. Trial records claim she confessed, under duress, that the cat spoke to her and acted on her command. She was hanged, and history labeled her delusional. But the real absurdity lies in the accusation, a talking cat. Why did people believe it? Because they needed to. In an era of helplessness, any explanation, however outlandish, was better than none. The European witch hunts followed a grim pattern. Most victims were women on society's edges, widows, healers, midwives. They were unprotected by men, defied religious norms, or were simply unpopular. Take Marriage Arian, a Dutch herbalist burned alive in 1591 after a patient accused her of witchcraft. Her crime? Touching his hair, which then curled strangely. The Church sanctioned her execution. When settlers sailed to the New World and established places like Salem, they carried this fear with them, tucked alongside their sacred texts. Their New Eden was built on the same shaky pillars: strict religion, suspicion of outsiders, and the suppression of dissent. Salem's Puritans, devout Calvinists, believed the devil was ever present. Every sickness, misfortune, or dispute was a chance to point fingers at the demonic. As historian Carol Carlson writes in The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, 1998, witchcraft accusations were a tool to make sense of and control a threatening world. And what was more threatening than a woman who defied control? When Reverend Samuel Parris's daughters, Betty and Abigail, began convulsing and crying out, Salem didn't respond with empathy but with dogma. A doctor ruled out natural causes, leaving only one explanation: the devil had infiltrated their town. The question wasn't whether witches existed, but who they were. Suspicion turned to certainty with terrifying speed. The girls pointed to three women: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, a slave. None of them matched Salem's image of the ideal woman. All were outsiders, and all would pay the price. But before we delve into the tragedy of Salem's trials, the lies, the blood, the hysteria, we must understand the fuel that fed its fire: the fear of women, the fear of rebellion, the fear of losing control. As one 17th-century cleric grimly warned, when a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil, Malleus Maleficarum, 1487. What if the devil's greatest trick wasn't convincing the world he didn't exist, but convincing it that the enemy was your neighbor? In the isolated village of Salem, nestled deep within the harsh winters of colonial Massachusetts, the air had grown thick with suspicion long before the first accusation was spoken aloud. The year was 1692, and tension brewed like a storm behind shuttered windows and beneath black hats. The village, home to just over 500 souls, had been carved out by Puritan settlers, men and women obsessed with moral purity and an unrelenting fear of the devil's hand in everyday misfortune. But what began as whispers of unnatural behavior would soon erupt into a wildfire of accusations and executions. At the center of this storm were two girls: Betty Paris, aged 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, 11. Their bodies twisted in spasms. They screamed, barked, and claimed invisible spirits tormented them. And the village believed every word. The Reverend Samuel Paris, a controversial figure even within his own community, was already struggling to maintain his authority. The strange afflictions of his daughter and niece offered a convenient enemy: Satan. A doctor had examined the girls and found no illness, no pox, no fever, no wound. What was left then but the supernatural? For the Puritans, this was not metaphor or superstition. It was doctrine. The devil was real, and he walked among them, corrupting through whispers and charms. The girls' fits, unexplained, violent, terrifying, were proof of his presence. Soon, more girls followed suit, each echoing the same symptoms. The sickness was spreading, and Salem braced itself for the only cure it knew: confession, punishment, and divine judgment. It didn't take long for the afflicted girls to name names. Sarah Good was the first, an impoverished woman, gruff and bitter, who survived only through the charity of others. Next was Sarah Osborne, estranged from the church and already embroiled in a legal dispute with one of Salem's most powerful families. Then came Tituba, the enslaved woman from the Paris household, whose origins were obscured by whispers of the Caribbean and strange customs. Each of these women had lived on the margins. They were not trusted, not liked, and, most importantly, not silent. Their fates were sealed not by evidence, but by social standing and reputation. When the girls cried out in agony and screamed the names of these women, no one doubted the voices of the afflicted. During the interrogations, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied every accusation. But Tituba broke. Under the pressure of relentless questioning and the violence that hovered unspoken in the room, she confessed. She said she had made a compact with the devil. She claimed a tall man from Boston had come to her, bidding her to serve him. She spoke of a black dog, of flying through the air, of a book signed in blood with names she could not read. Her words poured gasoline on a fire that was already raging. This confession changed everything. If there was a devil's book and it contained names still unknown, then Salem was in mortal danger. The hunt was no longer about 3 women. It was about rooting out a hidden network of Satan's followers hiding behind pious faces. The confessions, of course, did not come from nowhere. Tituba's position as a woman, enslaved, without protection, left her with few choices. Historians, such as Mary Beth Norton, argue that her account drew from the religious narratives she had heard in the Paris household, sermons laced with imagery of witchcraft and possession. Others suggest her knowledge may have stemmed from African or Caribbean spiritual traditions, misinterpreted as demonic rites. What mattered to the people of Salem was not the truth of her confession, but how well it fit their fears. The devil was among them, and now he had names. Soon, other girls joined the chorus of the possessed. Their accusations followed patterns: poor women, widows, midwives, or anyone who challenged the social order. And as the frenzy grew, the standard for evidence collapsed. The colony's leadership responded with swift and brutal measures. A special court was established, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, led by William Stoughton and backed by Governor William Phipps. It accepted spectral evidence, the claim that the spirit of a person had appeared in a dream or vision, as admissible in court. This decision would doom dozens. The accused had no defense, for how could one disprove a dream? Testimonies came not from witnesses, but from the tormented. Young girls claimed to see spirits in court, pointed to invisible wounds, and collapsed into fits of divine terror. The judges believed, and with belief came executions. Between June and September, dozens were sentenced, and 20 were put to death. All but 1 were hanged. Only Giles Corey, who refused to plead, was crushed to death under heavy stones. His final words: "More weight." One of the earliest and most disturbing executions was that of Bridget Bishop. Known in the village for her defiance, she wore bright clothes, spoke her mind, and had been accused of witchcraft once before. The court heard testimonies that she had bewitched children and stolen eggs that turned into a cat. It was enough. She was convicted and hanged in June. The madness did not end there. As accusations multiplied, even children were arrested. One of Sarah Good's daughters, only 4 years old, was imprisoned and questioned until she confessed, accusing her own mother. The line between victim and accuser blurred into dust. Some confessed to survive, others accused to save themselves, and behind it all, the machinery of fear ground on. By the end of the summer, the village was unraveling. Crops went unharvested. Families starved. The economy collapsed. Trust disappeared. Yet the trials continued. Even respected citizens like Martha Corey found themselves accused. Her crime? Publicly doubting the legitimacy of the girls' testimonies. Her husband, Giles, was crushed days before her execution. The people had stopped asking questions. They only wanted absolution. The church and the courts promised safety in exchange for submission. And still, more names were spoken. I do not deny that I have said and done things that may have led others to fear me, Tituba was recorded as saying, but I only told them what they wanted to hear. The devil, he is not the one who came to me. He was already here. The town of Salem, once rigidly held together by its Puritan doctrine and shared paranoia of the devil's presence, began to fragment under the weight of its own terror. Accusations multiplied rapidly, no longer confined to the outcasts or the defenseless. Respectable women, loyal churchgoers, and even relatives of the town's most influential citizens now found themselves trapped in the same widening net. Among those ensnared was Rebecca Nurse, a septuagenarian matriarch known for her piety and charitable deeds. Her arrest sent a shockwave through Salem. If Rebecca Nurse could be guilty, then no one was safe. The foundation of trust crumbled. Families turned against one another. Children testified against parents. Servants betrayed masters. The very social order the trials were meant to protect began to rot from within. The reach of the hysteria extended beyond Salem village itself. Nearby towns, hearing of the spiritual contagion, began their own investigations, their own arrests. In Andover, over 40 people were accused, many based solely on rumors or the erratic testimony of children. Fear became currency. To speak against the trials was to invite suspicion. To defend the accused was to risk becoming one of them. The Reverend George Burroughs, once a respected minister in Salem, was accused and arrested. He had left the village years prior after conflicts with the local elite, but his name returned on the lips of the possessed. They claimed he was the mastermind, the general of the Devil's Army in New England. When he was tried, little actual evidence was presented, only stories of spectral visitations and failed military ventures. Still, he was sentenced to hang. George Burroughs' execution in August of 1692 marked a turning point. As he stood on the gallows, he stunned the crowd by reciting the Lord's Prayer flawlessly. According to Puritan belief, no witch could utter the sacred words without faltering. The onlookers gasped. This should have been proof of innocence. But the machine of persecution no longer operated on logic. The sheriff tightened the rope anyway, and when Burroughs' body swung lifeless in the summer air, something shifted in the minds of the people. Doubt, once crushed under sermons and superstition, began to creep back in. How many more innocent people had been silenced? How many confessions had been forced under pain or fear? The hysteria had fed on its own momentum. But now the crowd, once hungry for blood, was beginning to look away. It wasn't just the public losing faith. Some members of the court itself began to question their actions. Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall resigned in protest after the execution of Bridget Bishop. Others, like Samuel Sewall, would later publicly repent for their roles in the tragedy. But repentance came too late for many. On September 22, 8 more people were executed, including Martha Corey and Mary Eastie. The executions were conducted on Gallows Hill, where crowds gathered to watch. No efforts were made to spare the accused. Even as legal standards crumbled and evidence grew thinner, the condemned were denied proper burials. Their bodies were dumped in shallow graves or left for animals. These were not just executions. They were erasures. To be accused of witchcraft was to be stripped of dignity, of memory, of humanity itself. By autumn, even Governor Phipps could not ignore the chaos. When his own wife was implicated, he finally dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer and forbade further arrests based solely on spectral evidence. In its place, a new court was formed with stricter rules, and many of the remaining prisoners were acquitted. Yet, the damage had already been done. Over 200 people had been accused. 20 were executed. Dozens more had died in prison, including infants born behind bars. Entire families were shattered. Land was seized, reputations destroyed, and all of it, every drop of blood spilled, was sanctioned in the name of righteousness. The devil, it seemed, never needed to show his face. The people of Salem had done his work for him. The aftermath was not one of swift healing. The village did not collectively exhale and move forward. Instead, the guilt lingered, the silence settled, and those who had spoken the loudest during the trials, who had screamed and wept and pointed fingers, faded into the background. Abigail Williams, one of the original accusers, disappeared from the records. No one knows where she went or how she lived. Betty Paris, her cousin, was sent away. The town tried to forget, but some, like Judge Sewell, could not. He stood in the congregation of South Church in Boston in January of 1697 and declared publicly, "I desire to take the blame and shame of it." The Salem Witch Trials, reader by Francis Hill. This act of contrition was unprecedented and tragically rare. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. When the execution stopped, Salem did not erupt in relief or celebration. There were no church bells rung, no solemn processions for the dead, no cleansing rituals to purge the guilt that hung thick over the village like the smoke from Gallows Hill. Instead, there was silence, a silence born not of peace, but of shame. The same mouths that had once screamed for justice, for divine punishment, now found no words. Families who had lost mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters faced their grief alone. As the village quietly tried to erase its own madness, the hysteria had subsided. But what remained was unbearable, an empty space where faith had turned into fear and law into vengeance. The silence was not healing. It was punishment. Life resumed in uneasy fragments. The fields were planted again, livestock tended, fences mended. But the work moved slowly, and the soil itself seemed to resist the hands that had condemned the innocent. Harvests were poor, as many of the men who had once worked the land had either been hanged, imprisoned, or ruined by association. Trade weakened, and neighboring towns viewed Salem with unease. It was not just the damage to its reputation, but the creeping suspicion that what had happened there could happen anywhere. The courts had called it justice. The preachers had called it God's will. But the people who remained, who had watched friends led in shackles or whispered prayers before the rope tightened, now called it something else, a curse. Even within the rigid hierarchy of Puritan society, the trials had created fractures impossible to mend. Entire families had been pulled apart by accusations, confessions, and betrayals. Husbands had testified against wives. Children had been forced to watch parents dragged from their homes. Some who had confessed to witchcraft in desperation were now ostracized as unclean, even though they had survived. Others who had refused to confess and died for it were remembered not as martyrs but as warnings. No one could speak their names without invoking discomfort or fear. Church pews that once overflowed with pious families now had empty spaces where no one sat. According to historian Emerson W. Baker, the trials left behind a spiritual scar as damaging as the physical one, A Storm of Witchcraft, 2014. It wasn't only the townspeople who carried this weight. The ministers, whose words had once stoked the flames, now faced growing skepticism. Reverend Samuel Paris, whose household had been the epicenter of the accusations, became the subject of intense scrutiny. Many believed he had used the trials to consolidate power, to punish his enemies under a veil of holy judgment. Church members began to withdraw their support, and eventually, Paris was asked to leave his post. His once commanding voice fell silent. His sermons, which once thundered against sin, now echoed with bitterness and self-pity. He left Salem in disgrace, burdened not only by public condemnation but, according to court records, an inner torment he never shed. The children who had stood at the center of the hysteria, those who had screamed and pointed, who had fainted and cursed, were not punished. No formal consequences were imposed on the young accusers. Yet their legacy haunted them. Years later, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prolific accusers, publicly confessed in front of her church that she had lied. In a written statement delivered in 1706, she said, "I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence, by reason of the vision of my weakness and frailty being deluded by Satan." Her confession was accepted, but it did little to erase the memory of those she had condemned. Her name, once feared, now evoked pity. She never married and died young. The others simply vanished into anonymity. The government, perhaps hoping to wash its hands of the blood spilled, declared a general fast and day of repentance in 1697. It was a symbolic gesture. The names of the dead were not cleared. The families received no formal reparations. Only years later did Massachusetts begin to acknowledge the injustice, offering small sums of money to descendants and slowly, reluctantly reversing the legal sentences of the executed. Yet even these efforts came with little public enthusiasm. The state wanted to forget. The survivors wanted to forget. But memory, especially one as bitter and deeply rooted as Salem's, does not die so easily. It burrows into the land, the language, and the soul. We walked among the ruins of what we had built, speaking only in whispers. For who could lift their voice in a town that had cried out for death? The Salem Witch Trials did not disappear into the quiet corners of history as a forgotten mistake. Instead, they remained suspended in the American psyche, resurfacing with every age that dared repeat their sins. For Salem was not merely a tragedy of its time. It was a mirror reflecting the darkest instincts of collective fear, social control, and religious extremism. In the years that followed, the village changed, the people changed, but the story stayed. It crept into sermons, into family stories, and eventually into literature, law, and the national conscience. As generations passed, the trials became not just a local catastrophe, but a universal symbol of what happens when truth is crushed beneath the weight of fear and silence is mistaken for justice. In the 19th century, the tale of Salem re-emerged in popular discourse, this time shaped not by clergy or judges, but by writers and historians determined to excavate the buried pain. The trials were reimagined through new lenses, romantic, moral, political. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a descendant of Judge John Hathorne, sought to reckon with his ancestors' legacy through allegory and symbolism in works like The House of the Seven Gables and The Scarlet Letter. He carried the name with bitterness, even altering the spelling of his surname to distance himself. His fiction was haunted by themes of guilt, sin, and societal punishment, all ghosts of Salem's shadow. In this, literature became both witness and penance, offering a voice to the dead when the courts and churches no longer would. By the 20th century, Salem had transformed into a cautionary tale taught in schools, debated in courtrooms, and analyzed in political commentary. In moments of national paranoia, from McCarthyism to modern cancel culture, Salem's ghost returned. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, written during the Red Scare, framed the trials as a metaphor for ideological persecution. Though a dramatization, it revived the terror of accusation without evidence, of guilt by association, of communities tearing themselves apart in pursuit of an imagined purity. Miller wrote, "We are what we always were in Salem," suggesting that the trials were not relics of a backward past, but warnings for any society that prioritizes fear over justice. Salem, in this sense, never ended. It merely changed form. The real descendants of Salem's victims, too, have carried the weight across centuries. Some remained silent, others pursued recognition. In the late 20th century and into the early 21st, official exonerations continued, some coming more than 300 years after the executions. In 2001, the state of Massachusetts formally cleared the final remaining names. It was an act more symbolic than reparative, but it acknowledged what had long been known, that the trials were born not of truth, but of terror. Museums and memorials now dot the town, and tourists walk the cobbled streets seeking ghosts. Yet beneath the commercialization lies a somber truth: these were real people with real lives, extinguished by the machinery of fear. The Church, once the engine behind moral enforcement in Salem, has largely refrained from revisiting its role. Modern denominations have, in scattered moments, issued apologies or statements of reflection. But no theological reckoning has matched the scale of the original sin. The question remains, why was the Church so quick to believe the devil was present in women's words, but so slow to see him in its own hands? That question haunts not only Salem, but every institution that places order above humanity and doctrine above doubt. For in the trials, the Church lost more than authority. It lost the trust of those who once knelt before it. And that loss, though rarely spoken aloud, still echoes in the hollow of every pew once filled with prayers for judgment. Salem's legacy is not bound by geography. The archetype of the witch hunt lives on in every society where accusation replaces evidence, where crowds follow fear, and where silence is treated as complicity. It appears in political purges, in digital mobs, in regimes that criminalize dissent under the guise of righteousness. It is not the devil that needs summoning in these moments. It is the memory of Salem. For it is only by remembering what hysteria did to that small village that we might prevent its return. As historian Stacy Schiff wrote in The Witches, Salem, 1692, the devil may have vanished, but fear has found new names, and truth remains ever at risk. Salem is not history. It is warning. I pray that none may suffer as we have suffered, nor that any court shall again be built upon shadows. For in the end, it was not witches we burned. It was our neighbors. Let that be the final word, carved not in stone, but in memory. Let it be repeated every time a voice is silenced, every time justice is twisted by fear. For the flames of Salem did not consume witches. They consumed the truth. And truth, once buried, always rises.